The winter of 1944 and 1945 saw the war in Europe enter its grinding, decisive phase. The Allied advance had stalled before one of nature's most effective fortifications, a wide and treacherous river. This waterway was not merely an obstacle, it was a psychological barrier separating the weary Allied armies from the final push into the German heartland. The retreating Wehrmacht had executed a textbook demolition, reducing the vital crossing to rubble and creating an impassable chasm. What remained was a desolate scene of twisted steel and splintered concrete, a graveyard of engineering ambition. The river itself was frigid and fast, its muddy waters a constant, menacing reminder of the immense task at hand. Every reconnaissance report confirmed the deliberate, systematic destruction of the bridge's foundation and supporting piers. German field commanders were confident that any major crossing would be delayed for weeks, perhaps even months, by the necessary reconstruction. They calculated the time required for moving heavy materials, stabilizing the banks, and building the complex infrastructure required for a permanent span. The American advance, so rapid and overwhelming just weeks prior, had been halted cold by the unforgiving combination of geography and German thoroughness. The muddy banks were churned into a swamp by the constant rain and heavy vehicle traffic, presenting an additional logistical nightmare. This river became a symbol of the war's stalemate, a daunting stretch of water mocking the overwhelming industrial might of the United States. It represented a pause that German high command desperately needed to regroup their forces and fortify their last lines of defense. For the young American infantryman staring across the water, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. The silence on the far bank was heavy, broken only by the sound of the relentless current and the distant artillery exchanges. In their deep concrete bunkers, miles from the river, the German generals felt a powerful, if temporary, surge of triumph. The successful demolition was viewed as a masterstroke of defensive engineering, perfectly executed to buy them precious time. They pored over detailed aerial photographs, smugly noting the precise locations of the bridge's collapsed sections and the extent of the surrounding destruction. The American ability to fight was acknowledged, but their prowess in rapid, complex construction was openly dismissed as a lumbering industrial fantasy. High-ranking officers, veterans of campaigns across Europe, scoffed at the idea of the Americans overcoming such a monumental obstacle quickly. General staff officers openly mocked the purported can-do spirit of the American forces, believing it was no match for practical engineering realities. One general reportedly remarked that the bridge would be finished when the Rhine freezes over, a sarcastic jab at the improbable nature of the task. They confidently predicted at least 6 weeks of sustained, visible construction before the first vehicle could even attempt a crossing. This period of delay was factored into all their defensive planning, allowing them to shift critical divisions and reinforce key positions in the interior. The German mindset was rooted in the slow, meticulous methods of pre-war European construction, which relied on concrete, massive piers, and a lengthy curing process. They completely underestimated the revolutionary, prefabricated nature of Allied engineering and the sheer, relentless drive of the American combat engineers. Intelligence reports from the front line, which noted a flurry of American activity near the water, were dismissed as merely preparatory feints or disorganized attempts. The generals believed their psychological advantage was secured, the enemy was stopped, and the clock was now ticking in their favor. Their arrogance was a blind spot, a fatal miscalculation born from years of relying on rigid, traditional military dogma. This hubris would soon turn to shock and profound strategic despair as their assumptions dissolved in the morning mist. The unit assigned the impossible task was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, specifically the dedicated Combat Engineer Battalions. These men were not simply builders, they were soldiers trained in the art of destruction and the science of lightning-fast construction. Their motto was Essayons, French for "let us try," a testament to their readiness to tackle any problem thrown at them. They were a unique blend of civilian skills, carpenters, surveyors, welders, and construction workers, turned into hardened frontline troops. Many had been pulled directly from massive civilian infrastructure projects back home, bringing a vast, practical knowledge base to the field. The combat engineers' essential purpose was to support the infantry's advance by clearing mines, reducing fortifications, and, most critically, bridging water obstacles. They operated under a completely different paradigm than their German counterparts, focusing on speed, modularity, and sheer force of will. For this particular river crossing, the engineers were fully aware of the German contempt and the immense pressure from their own command. Failure to complete the bridge meant the entire army's momentum would die, potentially prolonging the war by months. They worked under the constant, demoralizing shadow of enemy observation and the occasional, probing artillery strike. The engineers were masters of improvisation, often utilizing salvaged German materials alongside their own standardized equipment. Their strength lay not just in their tools, but in their training to ignore fatigue, to work through fear, and to find a way where no path existed. The leadership was focused and relentless, emphasizing safety protocols while maintaining an absolutely breakneck pace of operations. Every engineer knew the mission was vital, understanding that they held the strategic fate of the entire theater of operations in their weary hands. This was their moment to prove that American ingenuity and industrial organization could overcome any obstacle, natural or man-made. The true secret weapon in the engineers' arsenal was the revolutionary Bailey Bridge, an invention that changed the face of military logistics forever. Named for its brilliant British designer, Sir Donald Bailey, it was a modular, prefabricated truss bridge system perfectly suited for the fluidity of modern warfare. The bridge consisted of standardized, interlocking steel panels that could be rapidly assembled by hand, requiring no complex heavy lifting equipment. Every piece was interchangeable, simplifying the logistics and ensuring that damaged sections could be quickly replaced under fire. The system's brilliance lay in its simplicity and its ability to be pushed across a gap using rollers, without needing to launch heavy sections from a secured bank. It was a stark contrast to the fixed, cumbersome bridge designs of previous wars, which required intricate, custom-built spans. The Germans, relying on their heavy, fixed-design bridges and standard civil engineering practices, were completely unprepared for this innovation. They never conceived of a bridge that could be constructed piece by piece and rolled into place like a massive, articulated steel snake. The Bailey Bridge was designed for speed, engineered to carry the heaviest tanks and trucks of the Allied force immediately upon completion. Its robust construction meant that even a relatively small team of dedicated engineers could span a considerable distance in a matter of hours. The US had adopted the design enthusiastically, stockpiling thousands of the standardized parts in advance of the European invasion. This foresighted logistical planning ensured that every engineer battalion had the necessary components ready for immediate deployment at the river. The engineers treated the bridge components like giant, three-dimensional puzzles, having practiced their assembly in countless drills back in England and France. The components had been painted in dark, non-reflective colors, making the construction process incredibly difficult to spot at night, even under a bright moon. It was the perfect blend of British intellectual design and American industrial execution, a partnership that would soon shock the German High Command. As the winter sun began its swift descent, the commanding colonel called his senior staff into a makeshift command tent on the muddy riverbank. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the smell of wet wool and diesel fumes from the nearby idling equipment. His orders were clear, direct, and seemed almost fantastical to the tired men standing before him. The bridge must be operational by dawn. There was absolutely no margin for error or delay in the strategic timetable. This demanded a sustained, non-stop effort through the entire night, a period of less than 12 hours, to span a critical 400-foot gap. The colonel emphasized that this was a test of the American will, a strategic maneuver that relied solely on the engineers' ability to work faster than the enemy's disbelief. He pointed to the location on the map where German artillery was known to zero in, stressing that the team must prepare for sporadic, but intense, enemy fire. The engineers were told that their mission transcended mere construction. They were fundamentally resetting the entire war's tempo. Sapper platoons were immediately dispatched to begin clearing the riverbanks, removing debris, and setting the necessary anchor points. Heavy transport trucks, which had been concealed in nearby forests, began to roll forward, their headlights dimmed to the faintest glow. The engineers moved with a silent, practiced efficiency, each man knowing his precise role in the complex and dangerous dance of construction. Teams were assigned specific sections, with rotation schedules planned to combat the inevitable fatigue that would set in around midnight. Hot food and coffee were quickly distributed, a small concession to comfort before the relentless ordeal of the night began. Every single engineer understood the gravity of the colonel's demand and embraced the challenge with a focused, almost grim determination. They were preparing to wage a silent, industrial war against time and the confident overestimation of their German adversaries. As the last streaks of orange light faded from the western sky, the first sounds of American activity drifted across the river to the German observation posts. German soldiers, wrapped in heavy greatcoats, used powerful optics to watch the preparations unfolding on the distant, muddy bank. They could clearly see the movement of heavy machinery and the stacking of what appeared to be thousands of small, standardized steel components. The German officers laughed dismissively, noting the seemingly disorganized clutter of what they assumed were inadequate bridge parts. They radioed back to headquarters with reports confirming the American attempt was beginning, but with an added note of ridicule for their methods. The intelligence summary suggested that the Americans were making a futile, hurried effort that would inevitably collapse under its own weight or the slightest shell fire. The mocking tone in the German reports reinforced the command's existing belief that the Americans lacked the necessary patience for true siege engineering. They watched with detached amusement as the first, awkward-looking steel trusses were dragged to the river's edge on rollers. Some German machine gunners were ordered to fire short, harassing bursts across the water, more for sport than for tactical advantage. The engineers simply ignored the distant, intermittent fire, treating it as background noise to their crucial, all-consuming task. This initial phase of construction was the most vulnerable, requiring the precise positioning of the bridge's launching nose and the establishment of the bank supports. The German commanders believed they had all the time in the world to observe and plan their counterattacks once the bridge was truly underway. Their lack of immediate, aggressive action was a direct consequence of their scorn, a fatal delay that cost them the opportunity to halt the project early. They allowed the Americans to gain the necessary momentum, underestimating the speed at which the modular system could be assembled. The last flicker of daylight caught the gleaming steel sections, a spectacle of human effort that the Germans foolishly chose to interpret as a sign of weakness. The night descended with a thick, oppressive intensity, covering the construction site in a blanket of near-total darkness. Only the faint, heavily filtered light of flood lamps, aimed downward to conceal the activity from the air, illuminated the chaotic scene. The rhythmic clang of steel upon steel became the dominant sound, a metallic, relentless beat against the roar of the river. Engineers worked in tightly coordinated shifts, their faces streaked with mud and sweat, moving with the practiced efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The Bailey Bridge sections were quickly bolted together on the near bank, forming a long, rigid truss that extended towards the river. Using powerful winches and the force of their own bodies, the team began the painstaking process of pushing the massive steel structure across the water. The launching nose, a temporary, upward-curving front section, was designed to guide the heavy bridge structure across the gap. As the bridge extended over the river, it was supported by floating pontoons, which stabilized the span until it could rest on the far bank. The work was inherently dangerous, with the constant risk of a slip on the wet steel sending a man tumbling into the icy, churning current below. Supervising officers moved along the length of the growing span, their urgent, muffled commands barely audible over the noise of the construction. Every soldier on the site felt the strategic pressure, understanding that the weight of the entire Allied invasion now rested on their shoulders. Hour after hour, the bridge advanced, a steady, linear progression that seemed to defy the very laws of physics and military expectation. The German forces, largely relying on passive observation, failed to register the incredible speed of this silent, determined advance. The cold bit deep, but the intense physical exertion kept the engineers focused, transforming the impossible task into a monotonous routine of hard labor. The construction was a grueling testament to both human endurance and mechanical leverage, a relentless battle against fatigue and mass. Every bolt had to be perfectly aligned, every pin hammered home with a powerful, decisive blow to lock the modular sections together. The engineers' hands were raw and blistered, their muscles burning from the continuous lifting and maneuvering of the heavy steel parts. Despite the cold, steam rose from their bodies, visible in the faint light as they strained against the immense weight of the accumulating bridge structure. The winches groaned under the tension, the steel cables tightening and vibrating with the force required to propel the span forward. This was a physical operation carried out in a state of high anxiety, knowing that one error could compromise the entire structure and cost lives. The exhaustion became a tangible presence around 2 a.m., a leaden weight pulling on every man's eyelids and demanding a moment of rest. Yet, the leaders pushed the teams on, using short, sharp bursts of motivation and the shared urgency of the mission. The Bailey Bridge itself was a marvel of stress distribution, designed to withstand extraordinary loads while being constructed under the most adverse conditions. Engineers worked hip-deep in the cold, muddy river, securing the final support pontoons and ensuring the perfect lateral alignment of the span. The precision required was astonishing, demanding the finesse of a craftsman while enduring the relentless pace of a freight train. The continuous cycle of bolting, pushing, and securing became a trance-like activity, a focused blur of motion against the black backdrop of the night. Men communicated primarily through nonverbal cues and hand signals, their voices hoarse from shouting over the noise of the work. This intense labor was the price of their speed, a full investment of physical capital against the Germans' calculated delay. As the night wore on, the German High Command finally began to realize that the American activity was more significant than their initial mocking reports suggested. Sporadic artillery fire began to target the sounds of the construction, but the shell bursts were generally inaccurate and uncoordinated. The engineers had strategically placed smoke generators and utilized the natural fog of the river to mask the precise location of the working teams. The modular nature of the Bailey Bridge proved its worth, as minor impacts on the span caused negligible structural damage. A direct hit might destroy a single panel, but the surrounding sections would hold, allowing for quick replacement and minimal downtime. The engineers' training kicked in immediately during each short barrage, with men dropping their tools and taking cover without losing their nerve. Once the explosion subsided, they immediately returned to their tasks, the brief interruption failing to break their determined rhythm. The German response lacked the sustained, concentrated effort required to truly stop the construction project. They were hampered by the darkness, their poor observation, and their fundamental belief that the structure was temporary and easily destroyed. A focused air attack or a sustained, coordinated artillery barrage could have crippled the operation, but the Germans wasted precious hours in doubt. Their reluctance to commit major resources was a direct reflection of the general's dismissive attitude from the previous afternoon. They simply could not fathom the speed and the sheer mass of effort being thrown at the problem by the U.S. Army. This window of opportunity, granted by German arrogance and miscalculation, was the critical factor in the engineers' success. The explosions in the water were frightening, but they ultimately served only to steel the resolve of the American teams. The final, decisive hours before dawn were a period of frantic, energized effort as the end of the impossible task came into sight. A cool, misty fog, common to the river valley in the early morning, began to creep across the water, providing a final, natural screen. Through the mist, the engineers could see the far bank getting closer and closer, a testament to their continuous, back-breaking labor. The bridge was now a significant structure, a rigid steel pathway spanning the menacing gap that had stopped the entire army. The last few sections of the launching nose were carefully maneuvered until the massive span made solid contact with the German side of the river. A cheer, muffled by the fog and the continuing work, went up from the exhausted crews working the winches and rollers. The temporary launching nose was quickly detached and disassembled, revealing the final, flat, solid roadway ready for traffic. Engineers immediately began the critical task of securing the bridge to the far bank, cementing the temporary span into a permanent tactical reality. The final steel decking was laid down, creating a smooth, uninterrupted surface for the armored vehicles soon to follow. Trucks carrying earth and gravel were quickly brought forward to build the solid ramps needed to transition vehicles onto the steel structure. The sound of heavy machinery began to transition from the rhythmic clang of construction to the rumble of engines ready for movement. As the first faint, pale light appeared on the eastern horizon, the impossible was complete, a fully operational military bridge. The engineers stood back, momentarily stunned by the sheer magnitude of their overnight achievement, their exhaustion temporarily forgotten. The first German officer to report the completion of the bridge was treated with immediate suspicion and then outright disbelief by his superiors. He spoke of a massive, fully assembled steel bridge, ready for traffic, materializing from the night mist like a ghost ship. General Staff officers immediately ordered a flurry of reconnaissance flights and high-powered observations to confirm the impossible report. As the fog finally lifted, the truth was revealed in a horrifying, undeniable reality: a wide, sturdy bridge now spanned the chasm. The German generals stared in stunned silence, their earlier mockery turning to cold, strategic terror in a matter of moments. Their elaborate defensive timetable had been utterly shattered, destroyed not by heavy bombardment but by sheer, unexpected speed and industrial muscle. The time they had counted on to regroup and reposition their forces was now a vanished luxury, stolen by a group of determined engineers. The most senior generals erupted in a frustrated, furious exchange of accusations, their carefully laid plans now compromised beyond repair. They realized that their fundamental underestimation of American ingenuity had created a massive, unforeseen strategic vulnerability. The bridge was not a fragile, temporary structure, it was a solid pathway capable of bearing the full weight of an armored division. The sight of the fully constructed span was more than just a logistical defeat, it was a powerful psychological blow to the entire command structure. It was an undeniable symbol that the Americans could and would overcome any obstacle, no matter how daunting or how quickly. Orders were immediately issued for a massive artillery strike, but it was too little, and critically, it was too late to reverse the night's incredible accomplishment. With the sun fully risen, casting a triumphant glow on the steel structure, the order was given for the advance to resume. The very first vehicle to cross was not a staff car, but a massive M for Sherman tank, its tracks biting confidently onto the steel decking. The bridge held steady, a monument to the relentless effort of the engineers who were now watching their work translate into strategic victory. Following the lead tank, a continuous, roaring column of armor, trucks, and supply vehicles began to thunder across the newly finished span. The sight was intoxicating for the tired American infantry, who watched their path forward open up with unbelievable suddenness. The speed of the crossing immediately negated the German defensive strategy, which had relied on a prolonged period of American vulnerability. The unexpected rapid advance allowed the Allied forces to secure a critical foothold on the far bank before the German counterattack could be properly organized. The strategic consequences of the bridge's overnight construction were enormous, allowing the entire theater of operations to accelerate its push. The engineers, their mission accomplished, were already packing up their remaining gear, ready to move on to the next impossible task. Their anonymous, grueling night of labor had shifted the balance of power on the entire front and changed the course of the campaign. The bridge stood as a silent, powerful retort to the German general's initial, arrogant derision, a symbol of American resolve. It remains one of the most celebrated and important accomplishments of the U.S. Army combat engineers during the European conflict. The structure was the perfect marriage of innovative design, efficient logistics, and sheer, unmatched human will under fire. The bridge that appeared overnight became a legend, a testament to the fact that nothing can truly stop a determined force.